and Veronique for doing the Tenzo, the cooking. I hope, or I'm sure you enjoyed it just as much as I did. And well, everybody who was here during the last 2 days, congratulations to surviving. I don't know if I said that 2 years ago. I say that from time to time in Antaiji. Like during session, it sometimes happens that you feel like this is killing me. I'm dying here on the cushion. And if that happens, you don't have to worry, because if you die, I can bury you after the session behind. But I didn't say it this time because probably Kees, who is the owner of this hotel, he would make a funny face if there's a dozen or so dead bodies in the garden now. But actually, without joking, I never heard of anybody who actually died during the Zen. There's the stories of old Chinese monks who, when they felt they die of old age, during their last hours they sit in the Zen and then they die. But I never heard of anybody who actually died because of the physical or mental stress during the Zen. People die during accidents. Even in Antaiji there were accidents and people died during accidents. But that somebody died during the Zen I never heard of. Although you sometimes feel like this is killing me, this is killing me. But then miraculously it doesn't happen. Actually, from my experience, in the moment where you say, okay, if I die here on the cushion, then it becomes very easy, because you realize I don't even have to fight and I'm still living here. I'm still living on the cushion. I don't have to fight. I don't have to make this big effort, but if I just let go and say, okay, if this takes my life, then let it take my life. And then miraculously you realize, oh, I'm still alive and it comes from somewhere else. So not only as a kind of joke I say, don't worry, if you die, there's no problem, I'm going to take care of it. But actually that's the way it works. Once you let go of this psychological fear that you might die, you realize, oh, there's really nothing to worry about. Today I want to use the opportunity to talk about a text by Dogen. It's called Tenzokyokun, Instructions for the Cook. And it explains about the importance of cooking. The text starts like this. I just downloaded it from the internet, so it's available on the internet for those of you who don't know. Also in English you can buy it as a book. One thing, I think the title used to be Refining Your Life, from the Zen Kitchen to Enlightenment, and I don't know if the title changed. That's the text itself and the commentary by Uchiyama Roshi, so that I can also recommend. But then there's the Soto Zen text project by Stanford University, and that's the text. So if you print it out, it's 13 pages. It's not too long. It's too long to read it all today, but I will focus on the most important passages. The text starts like this. Buddhist monasteries have, in principle, 6 stewards. All are disciples of Buddha and all carry out the work of Buddha. These 6 stewards, I can't get them all together now, but one is the director, Kanyin, and then there's the Fusu, who's responsible of the finances. Then there's the Ino, who today in the monastery does all the chants during the ceremony, but he's also responsible to take care of the monks. Then there's the Shisui, that's the work leader. And then there's the Tenzo. And then there's another one which I don't collect now, but there's 6 altogether. Basically, when people live together in a community, you need responsible persons, or like during a session like this, like we have Veronique as the Tenzo, and there's Esther as the kind of director and taking care of finances, and this time we didn't have Samu, but if you have Samu you have a Shisui, things like that. Among them is the officer known as the cook, or in Japanese the Tenzo, who is in charge of preparing meals for the assembly of monks. The rules of purity for Chan monasteries says, in order to offer nourishment to the monks of the community, there is a cook. In this sentence, the word offer is important. The cook is making an offering. The community of monks traditionally, it's called the Sangha. And the Sangha is one of the three triple gems, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. So for the cook, it doesn't just mean that as a job he's providing food to people, but he's making an offering to the triple gems, to Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. Which is important to keep in mind. And Dogen continues, in general, the job of cook is an all-consuming pursuit of the way. So it takes one's whole energy. If one lacks the way-seeking mind, it will be nothing but a vain struggle and hardship without benefit in the end. Way-seeking mind, here's a translation of the word bodaishin or doshin in Japanese, and it's often translated as body mind, or do means way, so the mind of the way, but also like here it's sometimes translated as the way-seeking mind. Bodhi means, it's the same as in the Hanya Shingyo, Anuttara Samyaku Sambo Daishin, and that means totally completed enlightened mind. So it's basically Satori, the mind of Satori. But at the same time then it's also translated as the mind that is seeking for Satori. So first I'd like to explain a little bit about this mind. Dogen is saying if you don't have this mind and you're the cook, you're wasting your time, you're wasting your energy. You make a big effort but still you only feel miserable. So what is this Bodhi mind? Dogen Zenji gives several definitions in different texts. One is in the beginning of Gakudo Yojinchu. That's a text that lists 10 points that are important when you practice the way. And the first point is you need a Bodhi mind. And he starts with a definition by Nagarjuna, who's an old Indian philosopher. He lived about 2nd or 3rd century, so almost 2,000 years ago. And he says, Bodhi mind is the mind that sees impermanence. If you see impermanence, that's Bodhi mind. Why is that so? Dogen Zenji continues to explain that when you see impermanence, there's no use to be attached to your name and fame, basically to your ego. Because if you understand impermanence, it's not only about the things around you, but you understand I will die, and not only will I die, but right now I'm already impermanent in this moment. There's no substance to myself. And if you not only understand that intellectually, but feel that in your marrow and bones, there's no other way than to have Bodhi mind, that's enlightened mind, basically. And in a later work, in the Shobo Genzo, there's a chapter, or there's actually 2 chapters called Hotsubo Daishin. And because there's 2 chapters with that name, one is usually called Hotsumu Joshin. Both chapters were authored on the same day by Dogen Zenji, and people say that probably one was a lecture to lay people that were working on the construction site of Eheji, and the other was a lecture to the monks, because the other one is more Buddhist terminology, the Hotsumo Joshin chapter is more colloquial language. Anyway, in one of these chapters, the Hotsubo Daishin chapter, he says, Bodhi mind is the mind that vows to save all beings before oneself is saved. And that's quite a different definition from what we just had. First, Dogen Zenji says you have to see impermanence. Now he says you have to vow to save all beings before you are saved yourself. And then naturally people have the question, how is that possible? How can I possibly save anybody if I'm not saved myself? Isn't it not naturally to first save myself and then I can save others? Or other very clever people say, well, myself and the others are the same, aren't they? So what difference does it make? Why shouldn't I start with myself? Because I'm also part of the others. And that, of course, in theory is true. Buddhism doesn't distinguish between the self and the others. It's all one. But in practice, we know pretty sure the difference between if it hurts me or it hurts somebody else. There's a different amount of pain there. So in practice, we make that distinction. And in fact, I think it's the moment when we identify with all beings and say, I forget about myself. I might go to hell myself. Even if I go to hell, I will try to help at least one single being to be saved. Anybody. Forget completely about myself. In that moment, probably you realize you're saved already. There's no reason to worry about yourself, because the moment you have that wish to save one single being outside yourself, you are saved. It's just that normally we only worry about ourselves. What about me? That we feel so miserable. So Dogen Zenji, in a paradoxical way, he's showing the way to one's own liberation by saying, forget about yourself and think about how you can save everybody else, and then last you should be saved. Because when we think that way, that's the first time we can actually be liberated. Because liberation is always liberation from the ego, this idea that I must be good, I must be okay, I must be fine. So those are two definitions of Bodhi mind, enlightened mind, or way-seeking mind. In the Bendo wa, Dogen Zenji, and this is not about Bodhi mind, but about this way-seeking thing. Bendo wa is a text where Dogen Zenji explains about the importance of Zazen, why Zazen is important. And it's an exchange of 18 questions and answers. In one of the answers, Dogen Zenji quotes a koan, an old Chinese incident where a monk trains in a monastery, and the abbot, after a number of years, calls him and asks him, well, you've been living in my monastery for a number of years now, but you've never come and never asked me a question. Why is that? And the monk says, well, actually I have no more questions. All my problems have been solved in the monastery where I stayed before. And the abbot says, well, how did that happen? The monk says, in the monastery where I stayed before, I asked the abbot, actually I forgot the question. Maybe it was, what is Buddha? I asked, what is Buddha? And the abbot answered, the fire boy is seeking for fire. And this is how I understood. And now the new abbot, the abbot of the present monastery, asks him, well, that's a good answer, but I wonder if you really understood the answer. How did you understand that answer? And the monk says, well, fire boy belongs to fire. So it's just like the self seeking for the self. There's no reason for the self. Myself, we are already Buddha. What reason is there for Buddha seeking for Buddha? It's useless. The self looking for the self, fire boy looking for fire, that's useless. So I stopped seeking. And the abbot says, okay, I already thought you haven't understood, but actually you haven't understood. And the monk is very disappointed, because for a couple of years he thought he got it. And so he's asking the abbot, well, okay, if my interpretation was wrong, what then is Buddha? And the new abbot says, the fire boy comes seeking for fire. And then the monk understands. What does the monk understand? Actually, that's one of the main points in Dogen's teaching, which, for example, in a chapter called Genjokoan, he uses the example of wind and fanning to exemplify this. And as a technical expression, he says in Japanese, shusho ichinyo, which means practice and enlightenment are one. You can't divide between practice and enlightenment. These are not two things. In the example with the fanning in the wind, there's a master who's fanning himself because it's a hot day and he wants to enjoy the breeze. And the monk asks him, why do you have to fan yourself? The air is everywhere. Why move the air? Shouldn't you be able to enjoy the wind anyway? And the master says, okay, you understand that the air is everywhere, but you still don't understand how that air reaches you, how that air reaches here. And the monk asks, and well, how does the air reach here? And the master is just fanning. So basically, this action and the wind, you can't separate it. It's one. And that's the same with practice. The Zen practice, Samu practice, cooking practice. The Dharma, the Buddha Dharma, Buddhist truth is not separate from that. It's in this. So I said before that Bodhaishin can be translated as Bodhi mind, but that's not a translation. You can say way-seeking mind, but you can also say enlightened mind. Actually, these are one. It's not that there's a way-seeking mind first, and then you find enlightenment later, and then it's enlightened mind later. But the mind that awakens to the fact that I have to do something with my life. Each moment, I have to live this life. And there's no fixed way to live, but it matters how I live. That is way-seeking mind, but at the same time it's already enlightened mind. There's no enlightenment that comes after that. 2 days ago, or was it 3 days ago? 3 days ago, I gave a talk at the Aikido dojo close to here, and one of the people asked me after the talk, now, do you have this Satori experience? And that's a good question, because in all of the books about Zen you find this stories about Satori experiences. And first I answered, well, if you tell me exactly what you mean with Satori, then I will tell you if I have it or not. And he said, well, sorry, I can't tell you. So in a way I just escaped. But as a matter of fact...
do you have Satori?
Okay, so now I'm honest. No. Because Satori is nothing you can have. You can't have it. Satori is an attitude. It's a certain attitude, and in this text, Tenzokyokun, I don't think that Dogen Zenji actually uses the word Satori even once, but he's talking about the attitude. In Genjo Koan, that's the text where he's talking about this fanning in the winds. Dogen Zenji says, to carry yourself forwards and experience 10,000 things, that is delusion. The 10,000 things coming forward and experience themselves through yourself, that is enlightenment. So it's a change of direction when you approach the things. Usually we kind of tend to carry ourselves forward and grab at things. Like we want money, we want sex, we want a big house, a car, and finally we also want Satori. And that attitude is delusion. When we allow things to approach ourselves and to realize themselves through ourselves, that attitude is Satori, but you can't grasp it. So it would be a contradiction in itself to say, I have Satori, I have this experience. Of course, we all have certain kinds of experiences. What I just talked about, when you completely let go on the cushion and say, I'm going to die here, then you realize I'm still alive. It's wonderful I'm still alive. That's also some kind of experience. But to grasp it and say, oh, maybe it's a little Kensho, or maybe it's a small Satori, maybe it's a big Satori, that's useless. It's the attitude of, for example, what Dogen says about Bodhi mind. I don't count it all, but how can I save at least one living being? That is Satori. But that person doesn't think of himself, I have Satori, I have Satori. They completely let go and forget about it. That's when you say, oh, that guy maybe really has Satori. Usually it's the people around who maybe have the idea. It's not the person himself. Anyway, the cook also, he needs that attitude, a body-mind. And if you don't have the attitude, you still have to put in a lot of labor in the kitchen, but you will feel miserable and ask yourselves, why do I have to do all this labor while people are sitting there in the zendo and enjoying themselves doing the zen, and I have to work here alone. Okay, Dogen Zenji continues. I can't read this all, but he continues with instructions for the Tenzo. For example, do not indulge in a single moment of carelessness or laziness. Do not allow attentiveness to one thing result in overlooking another. Do not allow attentiveness to one thing result in overlooking another. That happens quite a lot of times, not only for the Tenzo, but for example, when we think we are mindful, we try to be mindful, and we're so mindful of one thing that we completely forget about the other thing. We're so mindful chewing our food, and we don't see that our neighbor needs water and the water is here. So a really mindful person would have their eyes wide open, just pass the water over. But sometimes it happens we're too mindful on whatever, and we're completely gone. So the Tenzo must not be mindful in that way, but see the whole landscape. The ancients said that cooks regard tying up their sleeves as the way-seeking mind. So here Dogen Zenji gives another definition of way-seeking mind, bodhi mind, and this one is very practical, tying up the sleeves. Those of you who have monk robes or who've seen the monk robes might have noticed there's these pieces of thread in the arm. Usually it's very long sleeves, and especially in Soto and Rinzai they're a little shorter because they are more active. The Soto monks are kind of very lazy and slow kind of compared to the Rinzai ones. So if you have the arm like this, it almost touches the ground. And this Buddhist robe doesn't originate in India, but it's from China. In China, the officials, the government officials, wore these robes because they don't have to work, as a kind of sign of their status. They have these long robes that don't allow them to work, actually, even if they wanted to. Because the monks, they were kind of like government officials. They lived in the monasteries, but the monasteries are run by state money, and the job of the monks in the monastery often is they have a certain amount of farmland, but although we have the idea that the old Chinese monks were self-sufficient, what they actually did, they have the peasants that live on the land, and they are basically owned by the monastery. So pretty much the same as the Christian monasteries in the Middle Ages in Europe. They own a lot of land and they own workers, and the monks have to see that the workers actually work, so that the monks have something to eat at the end of the year. So that's why they have these big robes. But then you might have noticed there's these threads inside the sleeves, and you can tie them, and then the sleeves move upwards. And that's when you do, for example, when you wash the dishes or you do work. So Dogen Zenji says here, bodhi mind means to tie up the sleeves. You stop saying, I'm a monk, I can't work, and that's what actually happens in some Buddhist traditions even now. In those traditions, of course, monks can't drink alcohol, they can't have sex, they have to keep to the precepts, but in exchange they don't have to work. So I'm a monk, I wait, you can give me some food, I cannot cook, you have to cook that food for me. That's also one way of practice. But in Dogen's tradition, tying up the sleeves, that's bodhi mind. That's what the cook does. Do not argue with the store officers over the amount of ingredients you have received. So in the old days, the Tenzo received the materials for cooking from the store officer. And in most monasteries, probably now, the Tenzo can decide by themselves. This is the menu I want to do, and either he goes shopping by himself or herself, or somebody goes shopping for the Tenzo. In Antaiji it's a little bit different because we're self-sufficient, and the Tenzo, before thinking about the menu, the Tenzo has to think about what he or she needs to use. What is there that I need to use? What can I do with that? So that's a change of perspective. Not what do I want to cook, what do I have over there, but rather what is there that I need to use? What can I do with that? In a way, that's also the change of perspective that in the Genjo-Koan is talked about when he says, don't carry yourself forward and look at 10,000 things, but rather allow 10,000 things to approach you and see how those things can realize themselves through you. Of course, that's pretty hard, especially in Antaiji. Most of the vegetables are kind of Japanese stuff, and when you come there as a foreigner, at first you don't know, well, what can I possibly do with this stuff? Or Brigitte can maybe tell you a story about that. Especially then, well, the last harvest is in autumn, and then you store those things away, and during the winter you use the same stuff over and over again. It gets less and less and less, and gets moldy, and in the spring there's arguments, and can we still use this? It's moldy, but we don't have anything else. We have to use it. No, I don't want to eat this anymore. And of course, in the end, the Tenzo has to take the blame for the food that appears on the table. During the day and through the night, whether things come and dwell in your mind, or your mind turns and dwells on things, put yourself on a par with them and diligently pursue the way. I like this sentence very much. I don't like it. I don't know it in this translation, but I like this sentence very much about the Tenzo and things coming to the Tenzo's mind, dwelling in the Tenzo's mind, and also the Tenzo turning his mind and dwelling on things. Because often, just as with mindfulness, we have this idea of, I don't want anything on my mind, at least during session. I want to forget about everything. In German we say abschalten. Ich will abschalten. I want to switch off. And for 5 days, if it's a 5-day session, or if it's 1.5 days, for 1.5 days I want to completely switch off and forget about everything. And that's not possible, and that's not practice, especially for the Tenzo. The Tenzo's mind always needs to be switched on. So it's not about forgetting about everything and nothing is coming to the mind, but rather the Tenzo always needs to allow things to enter the mind. For example, well, what do I want to cook for lunch? How many people will be there? What are they going to want to eat? How's the weather now? It's a hot day, so maybe people want to eat a salad. It's a cold day. People might want to eat a hot soup. Things like that will enter the mind, and the Tenzo allows them to enter his mind. And actually the Tenzo is turning his mind, and the mind is dwelling on things. So the mindfulness of the Tenzo doesn't mean that the mind is isolated in the mind and completely separate from things around, but rather things dwell in the mind is dwelling on things. These are in harmony with each other. Of old it was said, when steaming rice, treat the pot as one's head. When rinsing the rice, know that the water is one's own lifeblood. So that's how the mind and things interact. You completely identify with things. Of course, that's also important when you live together with people, but even with things. You're treating a pot or a cup like this as if it was a part of your own body, it's part of your own self. In a different text, I think, or maybe it's even the same text, Dogen Zenji says, treat temple property as if it was your eyeballs. And that's also an important phrase, because often it makes a difference to us if something belongs to us or it belongs to nobody, for example. I see that, for example, if people come to Antaiji and they buy their own rain boots before they come, or if they don't do that and they use Antaiji rain boots. Usually there's a difference in respect. If they paid for it with their own money, they treat it with respect. If they have the attitude, well, those are old rain boots that somebody left here anyway, they treat the rain boots like shit. And actually nothing we should treat like shit, but we should always kind of extend this border that we say, this is, I go until here and the rest is not part of me. And well, then there's my belongings, my possessions, that's what I paid for, that's what I worked for. Those are also important, but then the rest, which I don't paid for, that's property of everybody, that's not so important. That's an attitude that the Tenzo shouldn't have, of course. Then the most important part of the Tenzokyokun is when Dogen Zenji talks about his encounters with cooks in China. Most of you probably know about Dogen Zenji, maybe some don't, so let me explain a little bit. Dogen Zenji, Zenji just means Zen master, so Zen master Dogen lived from 1200 to 1253 in Japan. And he's the one who transmitted Zen from China to Japan. Buddhism already existed in Japan for 600 years at the time. So people knew about Buddhism, there were Buddhist monasteries, there were Buddhist priests at the time. Dogen Zenji ordained as a monk pretty early, as a teenager, when he was 12 or so. And he lived in one of the main monasteries until he was around 20 or so, maybe until he was 18. But he had doubts about Buddhism in Japan at his time. And the main reason for that was because in Japan at that time, just as in Japan today, and it is most all over the world with religious people, he saw a big contradiction between what people preached there and what they did in their daily lives. So people were talking about impermanence, but then it was all about, I have a golden robe and I live in a big monastery, and people enjoying their privileges, nobody actually practicing Buddha Dharma. And then there was especially one doubt that was strong in Dogen, which was, if we are all Buddhas, and that's what the Buddhists taught, we are already Buddha, we are already enlightened. If that's the case, how come that all the old Buddhas and patriarchs at one time during their life, they made up their mind to study the way and to practice? Why should that be necessary if we're already Buddha? And he asked the teachers in his time in Japan, and nobody could answer the question. And finally somebody came up with the idea, why don't you go to China? And maybe somebody knows there. So that's how Dogen ended up going to China together with his teacher Myosen in 1223, when he was 23 years old. And he spent 3 years in China. He came back when he was 26, 27. And they say that when he went to China, he'd already read the Tripitaka, which is the collection of all Buddhist sutras, which is a whole library. And they say he read that 3 times, so he knew the whole theory. He had been a monk for 10 years, so he had a lot of knowledge when he went to China, but still he had the idea, well, I don't really know the truth yet. I have to get the truth in China. So just for you as a background to the encounters that he had in China. The first encounter he describes like this. In the 5th month of the 16th year of the Jiading era, which is 1223, so when he had just arrived, I was on the ship at Qingyuan. While I was talking with the Japanese captain, there was an old monk who arrived. He was about 60 years old. He came directly onto the ship and inquired of the Japanese passengers if he could buy Japanese mushrooms. I invited him to drink tea and asked where he was from. He was the cook of the monastery on Mount Ayuwang. He said, I come from Sichuan, but I left my home village 40 years ago. This year I'm 61 years old. In the past I have trained in quite a few different monasteries. In recent years I stayed for a while with Guyun. I was able to register at Yuwang Monastery, but for some time I felt out of place. At the end of the summer retreat last year, however, I was appointed cook of that monastery. Tomorrow is the 5th day, and on that day there's a special feast. But the entire menu does not yet include a single delicacy. I need to cook noodle soup, but still have no mushrooms, and thus have made a special trip here to try to buy mushrooms to offer to the monks of the 10 directions. I asked him, what time did you leave there? The cook replied, after the midday meal. I inquired, how long is the road from Yuwang to here? He said 34 or 35 li. Li is, I think, about a kilometer. I asked, when will you return to the monastery? He said, if I can buy the mushrooms now, I will set off right after that. I said, today I did not expect to meet you and have a conversation on this ship. It is most fortunate, is it not, to form this karmic bond? I will treat the cook Zen master, that means you, to a meal. The cook said it is impossible. If I do not oversee the preparations for tomorrow's meal offering, I will not turn out well. I said, are there not co-workers in the monastery who understand the meals? What will be deficient if only one officer, the cook, is not present? The cook said, I took up this position in my later years. It is this old man's pursuit of the way. How could I hand it over to others? Besides, when I came, I did not ask to stay away overnight. I again asked the cook, you are venerable in years. Why don't you sit in meditation to pursue the way or contemplate the words of the ancients? It is troublesome being cook. All you do is labor. What good is that? The cook laughed and said, my good man from a foreign country, you do not yet understand pursuit of the way and do not yet know about written words. When I heard him speak in this manner, I suddenly felt ashamed and taken aback. I asked him, what are written words? What is the practice of the way? The cook said, if you do not slip up and pass by the place you ask about, how could you not be a man? This answer of the cook, I think, is a little bit difficult to understand, especially in this translation. Dogen is asking, what are written words? What is the practice of the way? And the answer is, if you do not slip up and pass by the place you ask about, how could you not be a man? Basically, I think he is saying, if you do not slip over that question, if you don't forget that question, if you really deeply penetrate in that question, there's no way how you could not be a man of the way, eventually, or actually in this moment. So just as with the fire boy and the fire, fire and seeking for fire are not two different things, but actually, because we are fire, we are seeking for fire. Because we are enlightened, we are seeking enlightenment. And the same here. The cook doesn't give an answer to the question here, but rather he's telling Dogen, keep with the question, keep the question, live through the question. Dogen continues, at the time I did not understand. The cook said, if you still don't understand, come to Yuwang Mountain at some other time in the future. On that occasion we can discuss the principle of written words. Having spoken thus, the cook got up and said, it is late in the day and I am in a hurry, so I am going back now. So that's Dogen's first encounter with a Chinese monk, actually, on the ship, when he still actually he had to wait for a couple of weeks in the harbor because of some visa regulations. Already at the time it was complicated. And so he had the fortune that Chinese monk came on top of the ship. But he refused to discuss the Dharma with him. but he just wanted the mushrooms and told him I'm in a hurry to get back. In the 7th month of the same year, I registered at Tiantong Monastery. While I was there, Tiantong in Japanese is Tendai. That's where Dogen Zenji eventually met his teacher, Tendo Nyojo. Tiantong is Tendo. While I was there, that cook came to meet me and said, "At the end of the summer retreat, I retired as cook and am now returning to my home village. I happened to hear disciples say that you were here. How could I not come to meet you?" I jumped for joy and was very grateful. In the ensuing conversation that I had with him, I brought up the karmic conditions of written words and pursuit of the way that we had discussed previously on the ship. The cook said, "The study of written words is to understand the purpose of written words. Exertion and pursuit of the way requires an affirmation of the purpose of pursuing the way." I asked him, "What are written words?" The cook answered, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I also asked, "What is the pursuit of the way?" He said, "In the whole world it can never be hidden." As many of these Zen encounters and koans, that's kind of cryptic. What are written words? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But then, for example, before I went to Japan, I also studied philosophy, and in philosophy, one big topic is the philosophy of language, the meaning of words. Nobody knows what the meaning of words is. We have words, but how's the meaning of a word attached to it? And for example, numbers are especially difficult to define. How do you define the number 3? You can say, well, this is 3, but that's not 3, it's 3 fingers. Or if you say this is 2, it could also be a peace sign or a victory sign or whatever. If you make it for 1, you could also have lots of misunderstandings. You point a finger at somebody and he might understand whatever. So numbers are difficult to define. If you really want to define between philosophers what the meaning of 3 is, you can discuss for hours. But if you teach it to a child, it's very easy. 1, 2, 3. Through counting, you know what numbers are. So words, like numbers, gain their meaning in practice. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's where numbers have their meaning. And apart from that, there's no meaning to a number. The same to all the words we use, like Satori, like Buddha, other words, tables, chairs. Those words only have a meaning in practice. Apart from practice, they have no meaning. So I understand this answer, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, as basically seeing words, written words, have a meaning in your practice. You give meaning to words through practice. Apart from that, there's no meaning to words. And that's of course true also for texts like this. We study this, we read this, we discuss it, but we don't practice it in our life. There's no meaning to it. We give meaning to it, or we don't give meaning to it according to the attitude we have in our life. The same with the second answer. What is pursuit of the way? In the whole world it can't be hidden. Sometimes in the beginning of practice, I don't know, maybe not with everyone, but at least with myself, I thought there must be something hidden in this world. Truth must be hidden somewhere. And I don't know where it is, but it must be somewhere, and maybe through Zen I can get it. Or the person who asked 3 days ago about the Satori experience, this, please can you tell me something about your Satori experience? So there's this idea, I don't have this Satori experience. I don't know what it is, but somebody must have it. Maybe somebody can tell me something about it. There must be this hidden knowledge somewhere. And the Buddhas and patriarchs, they know about it. I don't know about it, but maybe If I practice long enough, I also get it. And people misunderstand that attitude as pursuit of the way. You're drinking a cup of coffee. That's pursuit of the way. And it's the attitude with which you do all these little things in daily life, which is either practice or maybe it's not practice. But apart from that, it's nowhere. It's nowhere. So that's the two things that Dogen Zenji learned from the first cook he met. Things get their meaning in practice, and we practice what cannot be hidden. Our daily life, 24/7, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It can never be hidden. It's always here. The fact that we are alive. And we're cooking in the kitchen, we're eating at the table, we're taking a shit in the toilet. All of that is practice. And then there's another meeting with a Tenzo that Dogen Zenji describes. When I was at Tendo Monastery, the position of cook was held by Cook Yong of the same province as the monastery. Once, after the midday meal, I was passing through the east corridor on my way to the room where my teacher Myozen was being nursed, when I saw the cook in front of the Buddha hall airing mushrooms. He carried a bamboo staff in his hands, but had no hat on his head. The sun was hot, the ground tiles were hot, and sweat streamed over him as he worked diligently to dry the mushrooms. He was suffering a bit. With his backbone bent like a bow and his shaggy eyebrows, he resembled a crane. I approached and asked the cook his Dharma age. Dharma age is the age that has passed since you ordained as a monk. I asked his Dharma age. He said 68 years, so he must have been over 80. I said, "Why do you not employ postulants or laborers?" He said, "They are not me." And that's a very famous answer that he gave there. They are not me. Of course, other people can do our work for us, but they are not me. What about us? Practice is all it's about what I do in this moment. And even if somebody does my work for me, nobody can take this breath for me. Nobody can do this heartbeat for me. Nobody can live my life for me. And if we realize this, then also we realize that there's this job that we are doing right now, nobody can do it for us. We are the ones that needs to be doing that job. So his answer, they are not me. Dogen Zenji again, he doesn't understand. He asks, "Venerable Sir, your attitude is indeed proper, but the sun is so hot. Why are you doing this now?" The cook said, "What time should I wait for?" So first he's saying, what person, if not this person, should do it? I'm this person. I cannot be somebody else. And now he's referring to time. What time, if not now? I have only now. What time should I wait for? And Dogen says, "I took my leave, but as I walked along the corridor, I began to realize how important an opportunity this position affords." So Dogen Zenji came all the way from Japan by ship to China, and at the time it was both an expensive trip, because Japan had no money, of course. China was the center of the world, and also dangerous trip. Many people died because ships were sinking. He came to China, and he didn't find truth or the answer to his questions in the sutras, and he's not talking about Dharma talks by some very high-ranking abbots, but actually in these encounters with the cook that he found pointers to reality. It's about what you do right now in this moment. It's about your practice. At the end of the Tenzokyokun, there's another very important part, and I think Dogen Zenji, although he doesn't use the word body-mind here, I think he's talking about body-mind when he's talking about three minds. In Japanese, sanshin, three minds. And these three minds are Kishin, Roshin, Daishin in Japanese. Kishin is joyful mind. Ki is joy, so the mind of joy. Ro means literally old mind. And Dai means big or great, or sometimes people say magnanimous, big minds. Joyful minds, old mind, big mind. And he explains what these three minds are. Those are the minds basically that the Tenzo needs. And if you have these three minds, you can be the Tenzo, not only in the kitchen. The fact is, I'm not only talking about the kitchen job here, the job that Veronique did during the session, of course also, but when it comes to our lives, we are all the Tenzo. We are the cook of our own lives. So all of us, we are in the position of a cook. Sometimes maybe in the kitchen, but even outside the kitchen. In our family, at work, in our life in general, we are the ones that have to cook our lives and take responsibility for this life and see how we can cook this life so it's also delicious not only for ourselves but also others. So these three minds, Dogen Zenji explains as so-called joyful mind is the spirit of happiness. You should consider that if you were born in a heaven, you would be attached to pleasures without cease and would not be able to arouse the thought of enlightenment. Practice would not be feasible. So it's interesting that Dogen Zenji should start with heaven here. Later he says we should also be joyful that we were not born in hell. But he says first you should be happy that you're not in heaven now. Why? Because in heaven you wouldn't have the idea to do a session like this. You would be so happy you wouldn't even think about practicing Buddha Dharma. You would never encounter truth. You would be attached to pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. And heaven in Christianity is forever, but in Buddhism heaven only wears so long, maybe 10,000 years, maybe 20,000 years, and then you die. So the Buddhist idea is even if you're in heaven, you won't be there forever. And at the end of your lifespan in heaven, you go somewhere else. And where, that depends basically on your karma. So it's better from the Buddhist perspective to be born as a human being, experience suffering, ask for the reason of this suffering, and do something about it through practice. Because that way you can actually take the position of the cook and say, well, this is my responsibility. I'm here in the kitchen of my own life and I can cook my life. While in heaven, it's like in German we have this word Schlaraffenland, and you open your mouth and there's fried chicken flying into your mouth. There's always delicious food, but then someday life is over and what comes next is usually worse than that. So Dogen Zenji says you need to have this mind of joy. And that's easier said than done. Like for example, these 1.5 days, probably it wasn't hell all of the time for all of you, but there's also quite a lot of pain involved. And sometimes maybe also joy, but then it's in those moments which I spoke about in the beginning, when you let go completely and say, okay, I accept hell, I might die here on the cushion, and then you realize, oh, it's wonderful that I'm still alive here. And that kind of realization also you need as the cook. Otherwise, if you always compare yourself in the kitchen to what are the others doing now, or the meal is over, you're standing there washing the dishes, the others are drinking a coffee here, having fun. You're comparing yourself, there's no room for joy there. While if you have this realization, oh, it's great that I'm alive right now in this position, even here on the cushion, or in the kitchen, I'm able to do this work. I have the opportunity to make an offering to the Sangha. If you don't have that mind of joy, then it will be only a burden. You ask yourself, why am I the one who needs to do this job? And Well, actually, that's a state of mind that many people experience when they're in the kitchen in Antaji. I often felt like that when I was the Tenzo. It would be a lie if I say I always had this mind of joy. Often I ask, why do I have to be the Tenzo right now? Especially during the session, it's still okay. So I say, okay, at least I don't have the pain in the knees. But if it's a free day, everybody's enjoying their free day and you're in the kitchen, then you really have a hard time to motivate that mind of joy. The second mind, in this translation they call it elder's mind. Some people also, they translate it as parental mind. As I said, Roshin, literally it's old mind. Dogen Zenji says about old mind, so-called elder's mind is the spirit of fathers and mothers. It is, for example, like a father and mother who dote on an only child. One's thoughts of the three jewels are like their concentration on that one child. Even if they are poor or desperate, they strongly love and nurture that single child. That is often said about a bodhisattva, that he should think about all sentient beings as if they were his or her only child. So you love them, but not because they love you back, but unconditionally. Just for the sake of love. You can't help but doing something. And there's no calculation. If I do so much for the community, then the community will do so much for me. But it's just like that. And if you have that mind, again, of course, that's easy to say, but it's difficult to actually feel that kind of thing. Then of course being the Tenzo is easy. If you don't have it, of course you always ask, why doesn't say anybody thank you after the meal? And that's, well, how it is, for example, in Antaji. You get up early in the morning and it's cold in the kitchen, you have to start the fire. It's all made with wood, so you don't have gas, you don't have electricity at the stove. You start the fire, you cook there for 2 hours, 3 hours. The others do zazen at that time. You put the meal on the table, then it's usually, we eat pretty fast. They eat it in 10 minutes. And then there's wash up, and there's already the next step, cleaning of the building. Nobody says thank you, anything. Later there's a break, and people might come to you and say, well, we don't have hot water for the coffee, where's the hot water? People always complain about what you do. There's nobody who says, thank you very much for being the Tenzo. So without this mind, like a mother that's caring for a crying baby, you naturally ask yourself, well, what can you do for me? Why don't you appreciate me more? And I think that's how we all feel sometimes, in the family, at work, all the time. Now, why am I not more appreciated? Why don't people respect me more? Why does nobody say thank you? And Tenzo is one example where you have to invest much more labor and energy than you get back, or at least you don't realize what you get back. So for that you need the old mind, elder's mind, the grandmotherly mind. And Dogen Zenji also says about this point, the great teacher Shakyamuni, that's the historical Buddha, moreover apportioned 20 years of his lifespan as a Buddha to assist us in his age of the end of the Dharma. To assist us in this age of the end of the Dharma. What Dogen Zenji is referring to here is the historical Buddha died when he was 80. But people say that a Buddha can live until the age of 100. So why did he die when he was 80? So the story goes, he could have lived until the age of 100, but purposely he said, I'll die at 80, and these 20 years of my lifespan should be used for the Sangha in future times. So people say that when I'm going begging in Japan, in Osaka, people give me money without knowing me, without knowing what kind of life I lead. Still they give me money. And people say, well, that's because of this 20 years that Shakyamuni offered. That's the kind of virtue. Even now people give money to monks, people feed monks because of this 20 years. Dogen Zenji says that Shakyamuni gives 20 years of his lifespan. What was his intention? It was simply that he valued the spirit of fathers and mothers. A Tathagata, that means a Buddha, A Buddha is utterly incapable of seeking any reward or seeking any riches. So when Buddha gave 20 years of his lifetime, he didn't do it because of any calculation. He didn't want anything back. He just gave it. And with the same attitude, of course, the Tenzo and all of us needs to give. When we cook, we don't ask, what do I get back for that? Again, of course, that's hard. And yeah, in the winter, Brigitte probably remembers this discussion about, we have these about 100 kilos of mochi. Mochi is a form of rice cake in Japan. And when you eat it the first time, it's kind of interesting thing. It's a hard block of, how do you call it? You kind of stamp this rice, and first it's soft, but then when it's dry, it's one hard mass of rice, and you have to fry it so you can eat it. And you can eat it like that. You can eat it in a soup when it's soft. And 100 kilo, that's quite a lot of rice cake. So we receive that after New Year's, and we eat it all through March or so. And at some time molds start to grow on this. And so at a certain point of people ask, well, do we still have to eat it? And people stop eating it. And so when this happened again this winter, what I said is, well, even if it's bad for your health, I mean, think about the Buddha. He offered 20 years of his lifespan. So how can you possibly deny this donation? Well, of course, there are limits here, but it also depends on kind of the depth of the mold. But I've been eating the moldy mochi for 20 years now, and I'm still somehow I managed to. Anyway, last point also in my talk today, and the last point in the Tenzokyokun is big mind or great mind, magnanimous mind. Dogen Zenji says about this mind, so-called great mind is in its spirit like a great mountain or a great sea. It has no partiality and no factionalism. So the example he gives is a great sea, the ocean. What makes the ocean so huge? Basically it's that the ocean doesn't choose between, for example, the rivers that it wants to accept and some rivers that doesn't accept. The North Sea and the Atlantic Ocean don't say, well, we don't want any water from the River Rhine because it's so dirty. They take all of the rivers, and that makes what makes the ocean big. And of course, also the ocean allows again the atmosphere to absorb the water, and that builds clouds, and that allows the water to go through the whole cycle. That falls down as rain again on the continents, it becomes rivers, and again it flows into the ocean. So that's basically what big mind means, and that's the mind we need. And unfortunately, most of the time we choose between this river, okay, that's nice water, I like this river, but that river, no thank you. That's how we live our lives when dealing with people, when dealing with work, for example. Everybody wants to work in the garden, but nobody wants to clean the toilets, for example. That's how we choose, and that's not big mind. So Tenzo, he needs these three minds: a mind of joy, the mind of father and mother, and big mind, a mind that doesn't choose but accepts everything. And so this time, again, we were fortunate enough to have Veronique as a good example for Tenzo mind. But as I said, it's not only about the person who cooks during session, but about what we do from today on in our lives. We are the Tenzo in our lives, and we need these three minds. And they are together as one. They are called Bodhi minds, way-seeking mind, or enlightened mind even. We don't realize that this mind is enlightened mind, fortunately. If we think I'm enlightened, then it's not enlightened mind anymore. Way-seeking mind. We need this kind of mind. Okay, I'd like to stop my talk here, but if you have any questions, any opinions, anything you want to discuss, please feel welcome to do so. Anything? Any questions? Or if you hear this stuff for the first time today and there's any questions about words I said that you don't understand. Pardon?
Impertinence, or what is it called? I don't know the word, the Dutch translation for myself. And
Importance?
no.
Impertinence.
Ja.
Ja. Dat betekent dat niks altijd is.
Ja, maar is het oneind? Is het afhankelijkheid? Oké.
Oh, ja.
Dan ken je niet.
Impermanence, yes. Yeah.
I didn't know that word. Okay.
Yeah, Vergänglichkeit, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so that's one of the basic teachings of Buddhism. Everything is impermanent. And not, of course, not things only outside, but including myself. What I call myself is made up of factors like the six senses. Well, in Buddhism we say six, basically the five plus thoughts coming up. But all of this also, it's just put together and it's changing. Everything is changing, these factors are changing, and none of this can be separated and grasped. And another thing is there's no substance. So Buddhism says nothing is permanent, there's no substance. It's basically related. If there would be any substance, then that would be permanent, but there's no substance. So this table has no substance, I have no substance. Those are the basically these are the two pillars of Buddhism. Then what is most famous maybe the West when people talk about Buddhism is everything is suffering. And that also follows from these two things. If we as human beings have the attitude, but I should have a substance, and things should be permanent, my body should be permanent, my car shouldn't break down, my house shouldn't have a leak in the roof. With this attitude, of course, we suffer because that's not the way things work. We get older, we get sick, the car breaks down, it's raining through the roof. So that's why the Buddha said everything is suffering. It's not really suffering if you stop that attitude. It's just things don't come the way you would like them to come. And then actually, which is maybe less known, there's also a fourth truth. These three, everything is suffering, everything is impermanent, there's no substance, and then basically the stillness of nirvana. Everything is nirvana. That's also Buddhist truth, and that's when we basically let go of this idea things should be in the way I would like them to be. If I let go of that and accept reality as it is, yeah, then reality itself becomes nirvana. There's no reality here and nirvana over there, but reality, if I accept it as it is, that's nirvana. So those are basically the fundamentals of Buddhism, and impermanence or Vergänglichkeit is one of them.
Well, I had a few things actually I want to ask, and they actually all connect to this. First of all, I wanted to ask you if you wanted to say something about illusions and about the emptiness, but that's actually already covered pretty much by what you just said. And I have another question, and you talk now about the three jewels, Sangha. We talked about the fourfold truth, but what I never hear in Zazen is the eightfold way of Buddha. And I wonder why that is.
Yeah, why is it? I mean, the Four Noble Truths in Japan and China, there's not much talking about them. In all of the Mahayana sutras, they're almost never covered, while in the old Agama sutras, always Four Noble Truths, Four Noble Truths. And at some point in Mahayana Buddhism, obviously, they thought there's some more important things like that. Maybe also between this, because of this kind of dualistic distinction, there's suffering, there's attachment of suffering, but I can get rid of that attachment, and then there's nirvana over there. And the Eightfold Path is just like a ladder that I climb to get to nirvana. But then what you find in Mahayana and also in Dogen is in Japanese it's Hachidai Ningaku, the 8 awarenesses of great persons, the last chapter of the Shobogenzo. And basically the whole chapter is a quote from a Mahayana Sutra, and it's pretty close to the Eightfold Path. There's some differences. I don't know if I can remember either the Eightfold Path or these 8 awarenesses. But these 8 awarenesses of great people, Hachidai Ningaku, are Shōyoku Chisoku. Shōyoku means small desire. Chisoku means to understand it's enough. So it doesn't say no desire at all, but you just desire what you need, like oxygen for breathing, water for drinking, you need some food, you need some place to sleep. And usually when you realize that's what I need, you also realize I can get that. So you realize you have enough. But usually we want more. We want more. Even if we have 1 million, we want more than 1 million. So we never have enough. So our reality most of the time, and that's kind of illusion, the illusion you're asking for. I want more, I don't have enough. And even if I have more, I still don't have enough. These are the first 2, Shōyoku, Chisoku.